Good afternoon, and welcome to this conference on coalitional democracy. I'm Leslie McCall, and a professor of sociology and political science at the City University of New York's Graduate Center. I'm also the associate director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, which is co-sponsoring this conference. The Stone Center strives to better understand and address the problem of inequality in its multiple forms and from multiple disciplinary perspectives. We're grateful, therefore, to be joined by a remarkable group of speakers who are working on many different fronts and from several disciplines to tackle the problem of inequality. The other co-sponsor of tonight's event is the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs, which for the past 2 years has been hosting a series on the promise and perils of democracy, funded in part by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The vision of that series and of this conference is to, quote, inspire research, engage the public through thought-provoking events, establish collaborative networks, and ultimately to explore possible solutions to the current crisis of democracy. I personally can think of no more effective solution to both the current and long-standing crises of democracy than coalitional politics. But the idea of a coalition to end injustices of so many kinds is much easier said than done. Coalition is not a new idea, but one that was espoused most powerfully by Black feminists in the 1970s and 1980s. The current protests have made their voices more central than ever. But how much closer are we to achieving their vision? We're eager to hear what the panelists have to say about this crucial question at this crucial moment in history. I now want to pivot to thanking members of the team that made a conference on this topic possible, especially Karen Sander, Tim Ellis, and Jimmy Koch of GC Public Programs, and Tony Johnson and Vero Ordaz of the Stone Center. And I want to thank my co-organizer over the past few years, Dara Strolovitch, who will be moderating this upcoming first panel on the theory and practice of coalitional politics. Dara Strolovitch is professor of gender and sexuality studies at Princeton University, where she's also affiliated with the Politics and African American Studies departments. Her research focuses on the representation of marginalized groups from an intersectional perspective. I will also now briefly introduce the moderators of the other two panels, but please see their full bios and the full bios of all participants on our conference website. John Mollenkopf will be moderating the second panel on coalitions and political parties, which begins at 3 p.m. this afternoon, directly after this panel. He is Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the Graduate Center and Director of the GC Center for Urban Research. His research focuses on urban politics, immigrant political incorporation, and New York City politics. Ruth Milkman will be moderating the third and final panel on coalitions and social movements at 4:30 this afternoon. She is Distinguished Professor in Sociology and at the School for Labor and Urban Studies, both at the Graduate Center. Her research focuses on labor, immigration, and social movements. So welcome to our audience. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Dara, I turn the event over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for being such a great co-organizer as well. I want to say good afternoon to everyone and thank everyone for joining us today. As Leslie said, I'm Dara Strolovitch, and it's my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's first panel on the theory and practice of coalitions. Just to give you a sense of how this is going to go, I'm going to start with a few quick remarks to frame the panel topics, speaking briefly a little bit about them before I introduce our four excellent panelists, each of whom will speak for about 10 minutes. After their individual comments, we'll have a few minutes for us to talk to each other amongst ourselves, followed by about, we hope, around 10 minutes for questions from the audience, which you can write in the chat, and which will be sort of pre-fielded before we ask them to the panelists. So this first panel is intended to provide a broad introduction to the questions animating this conference. Things like how we can define coalitions, whether, why, and under what circumstances coalitions are politically effective, what some of the barriers to and promises of and payoffs for coalitions might be, and what ultimately might be done to create coalitions for broad-based change moving forward. And to address these widely ranging questions, the panelists are going to tell us what we can learn from their research, work, and experience about strategies for forging coalitions across a wide range of issues, movements, and organizations, including sorry, I've just lost my, there we go. Including what their work helps us to understand about the individual level psychological barriers to facilitators of coalitional thinking, the role of public policy and political institutions and processes in fostering and supporting coalition building, whether there are variations in the kinds of issues that animate and strategies that are effective for different groups and movements, including, but of course by no means limited to, feminists, working class people, LGBTQ people, people of color, union members, etc. Along similar lines, we'll discuss whether there are differences between the kinds of strategies that are effective when it comes to forging coalitions among progressives on the one hand and conservatives on the other hand. And we'll consider some of the particular issues when it comes to coalition building among actors and groups with different levels of and potentially conflicting bases of political power. Now, as Leslie suggested, these kinds of questions are not new ones, but they've come to feel particularly salient to many of us in the last 4 years, and I think especially in the last 6 months, as things including the current Trump administration, the pandemic, the energy of movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter have all raised the stakes of building broadly based solidarities and coalitions. But again, these questions and stakes of coalitions are not new. It's just one example, and alluding also to something Leslie already mentioned, speaking to a crowd of mostly white feminists at the 1981 West Coast Women's Music Festival about some of the particular challenges to effective coalitions among women and feminists, for example. Black feminist historian and musician Bernice Johnson Reagan argued that, and these are her words, "You don't go into coalition because you just like it. Real coalition work," she stated famously, "is not work done in your home. Instead," she argued, "it's some of the most dangerous work you can do." And dangerous and threatening as such work might be, Reagan also insisted that rather than retreating to what she referred to as separate barred rooms, feminists should harness what the Institute for Sustainable Communities has more recently characterized as the challenging, stretching, and often uncomfortable space of coalition building as a way to build stronger and more progressive movements. And from this perspective, Reagan's comments highlight both the importance of acknowledging and addressing power imbalances within coalitions, but also their transformative, prefigurative, and productive potential, reminding us that while they're difficult and often, as she put it, dangerous, they're also crucial for marginalized groups, for whom, in the words of critical race legal scholar Mari Matsuda, the gains from coalition outweigh the pains. And indeed, scholars and activists have long recognized that coalitions are hold particularly strong normative, ideological, and strategic benefits for movements and organizations representing weak, small, and disadvantaged groups. In my own work about advocacy and social movement organizations that represent groups like women, people of color, low-income people, and LGBTQ people, I found that almost all report having worked in coalitions at some point with approximately 2/3 reporting that they do so frequently. And I've also found that coalitions are particularly important as a way to address issues that affect disadvantaged subgroups of these broader marginalized constituencies, or what have come to be called, following critical race feminist legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionally marginalized groups. More specifically, I've found that coalitions can compensate for the lack of attention to the issues that affect these groups by highlighting connections among issues and constituencies, by promoting feelings of trust and solidarity, and what I call, drawing on Crenshaw and Michael Dawson's work, intersectionally linked fate, and by advancing more comprehensive solutions to the complex issues that face marginalized groups. But I also find that coalitions can be somewhat of a double-edged sword when it comes to advocacy for intersectionally marginalized groups and marginalized groups more generally. I don't have time to go into much detail, but briefly, I find that when organizations are involved in coalitions devoted to issues affecting intersectionally disadvantaged groups, their commitments are often weaker, participation tends to be more symbolic, and they're less likely to take the lead in advocacy activities than they are when it comes to issues affecting more advantaged subgroups of their constituencies. Larger, stronger groups often withdraw support from causes to which they object, and so it's sometimes left to the weakest, most resource-poor organizations to lead the difficult work of coalition building and maintenance when it comes to issues affecting disadvantaged subgroup issues. So they therefore often are weak organizations are often compelled to temper their policy goals to retain the support of stronger, often moderate organizations that have greater resources, political legitimacy, and clout. Many of these disparities, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, originate in reasonable considerations about maintaining access to policymakers, organizational maintenance, reputation, resource scarcity, et cetera. But their cumulative effect can often be that coalitions end up marginalizing issues affecting intersectionally disadvantaged subgroups, thereby reinforcing the broader marginalization of bias. in the advocacy group universe. So our panelists have much more to say about these and many other related issues. So I'm going to move now to introducing them. I'll start that by saying that we could devote our entire panel time to their long lists of accomplishments and accolades. And so I'll encourage you to read their full bios on the conference website. But very briefly, we are lucky today to have with us first, and we'll go in this order, and Allyn Brooks-LaSure, who's the Executive Vice President for Communication at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is one of the largest and longest standing coalitions in the US. We'll then hear from Alexander Hertel-Fernandez, who's an Associate Professor in the School for International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. After Alex, we'll hear from Jennifer Richeson, who's Professor of Psychology at Yale University. And our last speaker will be journalist Sarah Smarsh, whose most recent book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, was a finalist for the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2018. So with that, I'll turn the floor, I guess, the virtual floor, over to Allyn Brooks-LaSure.
Thank you, Dara, and thank you to all the organizers who brought us all together, and to my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to and to the attendees. I'm looking forward to our rich conversation on the issue of coalitions. I work at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We're a 70-year-old coalition of more than 220 organizations that over time have come together to do what we call build an America as good as its ideals. My interest in coalitions is because this is the third issue advocacy coalition I've worked for, and I've worked for two other coalitions on completely different issues, one on the issue of Darfur and the other on the issue of prostate cancer. And there are certain through lines that I observed in working for and with coalitions that I think is important as people think about examining them here in 2020 and beyond. The first that I would say, and this is building a little bit on what Leslie said a little earlier, is that coalitions are hard. You know, when she said that it's easier said than done. You know, I mentioned that this is the third issue advocacy coalition that I've worked for, but it's the only one that's still an issue advocacy coalition. The other two organizations that I worked for turned into organizations. They started as coalitions, and they started as this dynamic effort of bringing together various voices that were concerned about one single issue. In the case of prostate cancer, this disparate group that had different types of resources, different types of energy, different types of expertise. But over time, they really wanted to speak as an organization. And what I have observed in many cases, not just with coalitions that I've worked for, and these are proper coalition organizations, they struggle between wanting to be an organization and wanting to be a coalition, and really trying to navigate those constitutional challenges of, do we really want to speak with just our voice and say that we have other people with us, or do we really want to speak as a collective and speak as a group? So it's important, I think, in examining, and when entities are interested in going into coalition with others, that we're really certain that that's what you want to do, that you want to be in coalition with others. The other thing that I would say is the Leadership Conference is unique in that there were a lot of civil rights coalitions that started. We were founded in 1950. There were a lot of, and we were essentially a fusion of racial justice organizations, including the NAACP, labor, including the National Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and Jewish religious organizations. So that came together and essentially said in 1950 that we think there should be an entity that's working in Washington on civil rights legislation. But our coalition, if the founders of our coalition back in 1950 had looked at our membership now, and even looked at our issue areas that we work on now, they wouldn't recognize the Leadership Conference. And that's probably a good thing. I would say that over the course of the past 70 years, we have changed the definition of what it means to be within the movement, and when in movements that were outside of what had traditionally been considered the civil rights movement have been brought inside the tent. So our coalition now includes autism organizations, led by atheists that argue for the separation of church and state. There are a lot of organizations that are part of our coalition now that were not a part of it in the very beginning. And I think that dynamism is important, particularly when the Leadership Conference, we're a multi-issue coalition. And I think when you are looking at an issue of more than just advocating on more than just one issue, it is important to maintain a certain dynamism in order to thrive, particularly as politics change. There was a time when persons who were differently abled were not included in our coalition. Now they're a key part of our coalition, and all types of disability, not just physical disability, intellectual disabilities as well. We want to make sure we are constantly asking the question now, with more than 220 organizations in our coalition that run the gamut from AARP and the ACLU to the United Methodist Church and the Unitarians and essentially everyone in between, of who is not at the table that should be at the table. And I think that is a question that really dynamic coalitions will constantly ask themselves. It's not enough that we're here. There is somebody that's being excluded it could be for a variety of reasons. Who is that constituency? Who is that cohort that's being left out? And what do we need to do in order to bring them into the fold? I think the work of coalition is more important now than ever because there are concerted efforts, I feel like, that are trying to divide us, that they see the strength of coalition coming together, and that scares them. It should. And I think that speaks to the imperative of really trying to come together, fusing coalition, and I would say unlikely coalitions. One of our members works on issues, the intersection of racial justice and immigration. So they are a Black immigration organization. It is important for all of our members to stand with them, even organizations that are not advocating on immigration issues. But for them, when they make a call, for them to have a strong outpouring of support from within our coalition to make it clear that when this group is speaking, they're not speaking alone. They're speaking with the power of more than 200 organizations standing alongside them as well. I think that's the only way that we're going to achieve change. There's such gridlock here in Washington, D.C., and I think it's important. Organizations will advocate for themselves and for specific constituencies. I think that's natural, but I think when we're speaking as and for a coalition, something special is happening. I think one of the things that's important for us to do in coalition is making sure that we're not in competition with each other. I have seen that in other coalitions where we say we want to come together as a coalition, but we're really competing with each other. You can see this for those of you who are historians, in the history of the traditional civil rights movement between 54 and 1968, where they were arguing over fundraising. They were arguing over headlines. They were arguing over who is in what territory. And I think those are sometimes the challenges that are inherent in coalition work, where everyone is doing good work and everyone wants to do it everywhere, and really making sure that we're able to put aside territorial and competitive challenges and really try to transcend that for the greater good. So I would say that coalitions are hard, coalitions are dynamic, and coalitions are absolutely needed now more than they've ever been before. And then I think I'll end there. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Hertel-Fernandez from Columbia University.
Thanks so much, Dara. And thanks so much, Dara and Leslie and the Stone Center for organizing this. I just want to recognize the space that we have amidst everything that's happening in the world to take a step back and reflect on these larger developments in American politics that I think are so crucial. So I want to use my time to say a little bit about coalition building on the political right among actors that we often think of as being relatively advantaged, wealthy individuals, private sector businesses, for instance. And I think it's an important episode to understand why we see the developments that we do today, but I think it's also important for understanding what the ways are that coalition building on the right is applicable to the left, and where there may be similar dynamics and where there may be different ones by nature of the ideologies that underpin the left and the right, the types of actors who are involved in their policy objectives. More specifically, the example I want to tell you about involves conservatives trying to gain a foothold and control across the states. And today it's so clear that that there is a large conservative Republican advantage in control of state houses and the output that those state houses are producing. But if you rewind the tape to the 1960s and 70s, the present day successes of the conservative movement are actually not at all preordained. It was the political right that was on the defensive. They were worried about an increasing regulatory state, welfare state, public sector unions that were emerging as a powerful federated force to push back against conservative priorities at the state level. And facing these challenges, conservative operatives realized that they needed to assemble coalitions of their own that could push back, gain control first of state houses and governorships, and then come up with a policy agenda that would allow them to maintain that power over time. Those coalitions consisted of several important constituencies: the religious right, private sector businesses, wealthy individual donors, and libertarian activists. And it's easy to look at that constellation of forces today, I think, and say, of course, they have a common interest in working together. Of course, they have a combined policy agenda that holds together well. But as I've documented in my research, at the time, there were actually some deep tensions between these groups. And it's a puzzle as to why I think they were able to work together. And I think that conveys some important lessons for understanding that movement and the left as well. I think there are also some important narratives that exist about what has happened on the right that we should push back against a little bit when we have an appreciation of how this coalition building actually happened. I think there's a tendency to think that a conservative ideology is inherently more unifying than a liberal ideology. That's an argument that's been advanced in political science. And I think that may be true at the mass level. There's evidence for that. But at the elite level, there are some real tensions between, say, libertarian donors or activists who care deeply about retrenching the state across all dimensions, and private sector businesses that want to see subsidies or regulations that are good for their industry. Similarly, I think there are tensions between libertarians and the religious right, and between the religious right and certain segments of the business community that we're just not interested in these hot button social issues that many of the ideological conservatives wanted to engage in, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And so I don't think that ideology offers a compelling explanation, nor does necessarily the presence of individual very wealthy donors on the right completely explain the story either, because while it certainly makes it easier for these organizations to accumulate resources, you still have to assemble broad coalitions in many cases to gain control of states, particularly so many states all across the country. So how did they manage it? Well, in my work, I focused in particular on one organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. That's a conservative coalition of lawmakers and businesses and many of these activists and donors that have tried to develop a conservative policy platform and promote it across the states. And I think ALEC in particular offers some important lessons about how conservatives were able to pull this off. So first, ALEC came up with organizational structures that mediated conflicts between coalition members and allowed, within particular issues, the coalition members that were most invested in an area to drive the policy agenda. So it was a combination of decentralization by issue, and then within issue, the most invested actors were allowed to take the lead. And the decision rule within these issues was quite simple. Whoever was willing to pay more got to write the model legislation, whether that was Enron, for instance, seeking electricity deregulation going up against the utilities in the 1990s, or tobacco companies that were fighting one another over regulations throughout the early 2000s. And so this structure has the virtue of being very transparent to coalition members. And it also, I'm sure, as you can identify, has the advantage of raising more money for the organization as a whole. So there was an explicit governance decision that allowed this coalition to manage these internal conflicts. The other piece of the puzzle that ALEC and other conservative groups identified that I think allowed them to hold these coalitions together is finding policies that provided both material and symbolic benefits to each of their coalition partners, and then socializing and committing political education to their coalition members to teach them why these policies would be in their interest. And I think a nice example of that from the 1980s is ALEC's big push for tort reform, which was very explicitly done so that it could attract private sector businesses on the one hand who wanted to reduce liability for all of the legal claims that workers and consumers and environmental activists were waging against them. And on the ideological right, tort reform weakened the trial lawyer bench, which is just an incredibly important constituency for Democrats and liberal causes in many states. So in that way, by creating a policy campaign that had something in it for both of these members, ALEC was able to bring people who previously were not willing to join the organization together. So I think both of those mechanisms are things that progressives could learn from, liberals could learn from, but I think there are some ways in which the lessons of ALEC and the coalition construction that I've just talked about may not be applicable, and it's worth thinking through what those are. So for one thing, the decision rule that I just explained within ALEC accepted inequalities of resources, that different groups were going to have different capacities to pay to play, basically, without attending to the fact that some groups may simply be structurally disadvantaged. In addition, ALEC was willing to accept, I think, a great deal of incoherence and contradiction at many points in time between different committees that were working on issues that might have either come into conflict with one another or actually been pushing in opposite directions. And so it's an open question whether organizations that have a more unified ideology or set of principles that guide their work would be willing to adopt a similar strategy. And lastly, I think the policies that glued together many of its constituent parts were ones that were relatively easier than comparable policies on the left might be, in so much as they were targeting organizations for destruction, whether it was the trial lawyers or reproductive rights groups or labor unions. And I just think it's inherently easier to construct these policies that are demobilizing rather than mobilizing in character. So I think I'll end there, but really looking forward to the discussion and thinking more about what we can learn from the left and the right in terms of coalitional structure and design.
Thank you, Alex, so much for that really interesting contrast in some ways to what we've been talking about so far. Next up, we have Jennifer Richeson.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And yes, let me just join the chorus of thanking you, Dara, obviously Leslie, my good friend from back in the Northwestern days together, the Stone Center, all the organizers, my fellow panelists, and everyone who logged in today. I know there are 1,000 other things to be monitoring today, including who does and does not have COVID after the information that came out yesterday. But it's really an honor and privilege to be with you today and for you to join us today. And really, it's amazing to be in conversation with such a diversity of people working on these issues, both scholars and practitioners, and just people who are interested because, yeah, we need to figure out broadly how to bridge the divides that are constantly being reforged or emerging in our politics to ends that many of us find unacceptable. So I invite you to zoom back to November 2008 with me for a minute. Maybe that's happier times for some of you. If you recall, Barack Obama won the presidential election that year, largely which now understood as a broad and notably racially diverse coalition of voters, of supporters. Of course, at the same time, Proposition 8, limiting the right to same-sex marriage, passed in California, and at the time, at least, exposed a rift between African-American voters, largely due to religious commitments, and our lesbian and gay Americans. So at the same time, the same moment, the promise of cross-group coalition for progressive ends and policies, and the difficulty of the very same, depending on issue, depending on groups, depending on context, were laid bare. And it was this moment that actually animated a new line of research in my lab that we've been working on ever since. But let me back up. I'm a social psychologist. I study, social psychologists broadly study how our group memberships and affiliations affect how we understand ourselves, but also how we think and behave. And I've been working on the questions of intergroup relations, discrimination, largely how people think about inequality for some time. And this moment, in many ways, was so compelling to me and to the students in my lab that we really went and looked back at the just classic literature on intergroup relations, on discrimination, in particular in my field, to get a sense of, is there any way for us to make sense of this? Or at least how can we make sense of this? And largely the question was yes, in some ways, and I'll go through a bit of that, but also no, that our models of intergroup relations, of coalition building, were really around groups of the same status, that are largely allies, that have no reason to be in competition, and that there's sort of no real sort of, I guess, inter-group discrimination, I guess. And so what we really needed to do was to say, okay, like what we think we know is insufficient in this moment to understanding what we're seeing now, and also to predict how members of different groups, especially members of different marginalized groups, might come to understand, work with, and feel about one another in the wake of lots of sort of a dominant group that would rather keep them separate. Okay, so one of the most relevant and enduring findings of my field, again, social psychology, is the role of our social group affiliations, what we call social identities, in shaping our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, almost everything. We are less independent and than our culture likes to tell us we are, or we like to believe that we are. And of course, the groups that we identify most strongly with and are most relevant in our culture organize what we do, but they also filter the way we experience and observe the world. Right, and while even distinctions that are fairly minimal and largely meaningless can lead us to treat folks who are part of our in-groups, right, people identified with the same groups as we do, better than out-groups, you know, and in lots of ways, sort of this in-group favoritism we know is extremely pervasive, right? We share resources with fellow in-group members, we trust them more, we give them the benefit of the doubt when they falter, and of course we like them more. My favorite example is when you see somebody coming, trying to get to the elevator and the doors are closing. If you recognize them as an in-group member, you work really hard to find that button to keep the doors open. If you don't have any sort of cues to that, you just stand there hopelessly like, oh, sorry, and the doors close, right? So we know that these group memberships, you know, really do sort of help us understand who we are, and they keep us connected to other people in important ways, right? Again, the more cherished and valued the groups, the more meaningful they are, the more connected we are to them. And these are all good things. They help us understand who we are. They help us cope with all manner of insults in the world, including too much information. So they help us make the world less uncertain. They give us stories, narratives about our culture, about who we are, where we've been, maybe where we're going. They give us connections to deities, right? So, I mean, to our ancestors, right? So they're largely incredibly powerful, and we cherish them and we need them. So I just want to put that out there, because often, you know, even in a conversation on coalitions, often the ask is for people to downplay or to really shed the very identities that are extremely valuable and meaning to them in the service of the coalition, right? And that is just psychologically untenable, right? So then how do we bridge divides, right? So we know that all of these goodies of group membership certainly do come with in-group favoritism, right? But they don't automatically come with sort of the complementary reaction, derogation against the even relevant outgroup, with the one exception as if the outgroup is the reason why the group exists, right? So you've been cast out of a group, there's often some sort of hurt feelings, right? If that's the very meaning, the reason why your in-group exists, there's often some sort of feelings, you know, there. And we know discrimination does create lots of groups, and we need to think about those somewhat differently. But even then, you know, it's not necessarily the case that groups will have animosity with one another, especially groups that are somewhat similarly positioned, or they're somewhat, they feel to be somewhat autonomous, right? They're you know, groups based on racial categorizations versus groups based on sexual minority status or religious affiliation, right? They're just sort of out there existing on their own. What changes this often is the experience of threats. Threats to the existence of the group are the most potent, and people will fight like the dickens to maintain their group identity, and will aggress toward outgroups, not necessarily the outgroup that actually is threatening them the most, right, in their existence. It can be other outgroups that are just out in the world, especially if they are perceived to be more vulnerable, sort of down the pecking order, right? And this sort of status-based, kicking folks who are down or raising your own sense of esteem or status at the expense of another group is one response, right? And we know that one. The one that I want to sort of lift up, in the sort of remaining few moments is the promise of forging common bounds, a common identity, which is a superordinate identity, right? It doesn't require people to shed their individual value group memberships, but what adds to it a common identity that also can be forged from perceived or actual marginalization. And this is actually the identity that often brings coalitions together, especially people who are stigmatized in society. It could be around common victimization, right? And this is one that it could be anything, but that one is also a pathway. In fact, an extremely powerful and promising one. And we've heard that in some of the comments already. And that common identity, right, not only does it provide a space that we are victims of this larger system, the dominant culture, whatever it is, the elite, picking a common enemy outgroup, but it's incredibly effective, right? But it also allows people, especially across dimensions of identity, so from race to sexual minority status, for instance, to understand themselves as similarly positioned and as similarly vulnerable. And that type of vulnerability is actually incredibly powerful to have people's common humanity emerge again and be seen by one another. And that actually is probably one of the most promising ways to forge connection, both between individuals, but also between groups. And I'll stop there.
Hey folks, I think that our moderator, Dara, might be frozen due to her connection. And so I'm going to go ahead and hop in. This is Sarah Smarsh. Hello, I'm a journalist based in rural Kansas from where I join you today. And I also thank everyone for making this event possible, and to those of you who are joining us virtually for this important discussion. I am going to talk a little bit about a version of the white working class that is not so familiar in modern political discourse, and that is the progressive coalition building within that demographic, which, believe it or not, has happened many times in our country's history and is alive right now, though receives fewer headlines than another political faction of that demographic. So I'm going to tell a couple of stories from history in my home state of Kansas, and then talk a little bit about how we find ourselves where we do today with, strong racial fractures within the working class in terms of political leanings as well as coalition building. In the 1890s, there was a group of Kansas farmers who found themselves bankrupt due to there were falling crop prices and drought, but also greedy railroad monopolies and basically a federal government serving powerful interests, and all of these things kind of swirled around to create this precarious moment for the Kansas farmer. They coined the phrase populist to describe an alliance of the people. And that movement actually spread across the entire country and ended up as a national coalition of farmers, unions, and workers' organizations with very progressive at the time and radical ideas that included labor rights, corporate regulation, a progressive income tax, women's suffrage, and the 8-hour workday. Now, the 1890s, of course, was like most moments in our national history, not a good time for people of color or women, and you know, basically a lack of true unity within that movement was ultimately its demise. You can look into how that moment was kind of thwarted by racism and nativism within its own ranks, but at any rate, the Democratic Party today owes much of its platform to that coalition, which had a heavy organizing contingent of folks whom we would describe today as the white working class. Fast forward about 30 years, and there's a pretty interesting uprising in southeast Kansas, where at the time there was quite a bit of coal mining going on, not so much today, but this coal mining was being done mostly by white European immigrants who, you know, were facing very dangerous working conditions with very few rights as laborers. And these male workers were sort of stymied in their protests and efforts against the coal bosses and these big companies that were endangering their lives for lack of health standards and low pay and so on. The women in those men's lives, the wives and mothers and grandmothers of these workers, created a coalition, and something that ended up being known in national headlines and what was famous across the country as the Amazon Army. And this was female white working class members, granted with a specific sort of element of marginalization about them, in that they were immigrant families, who successfully rose up and were quite successful in engendering a national conversation about workers' rights, and a lot of good things came of that. So here we are 100 years later, and these groups, who, by the way, my particular interest in that demographic is because it's where I come from. I grew up on a small wheat farm in Kansas, and I still live by choice in rural Kansas today as a journalist, reporting on issues of socioeconomic class as it intersects with place, race, and all other sorts of aspects of American identity. And you know, I was born about 40 years ago at a very specifically engineered moment in terms of class and race and the potential for coalition building. Reagan's election and the deregulation and union busting that followed, which was by no means a new idea on the right, but has had particular success, of course, in recent decades, meant that I grew up without any sense of what we are all discussing today, this concept of a coalition and the political and civic agency that one indeed has in a democracy, at least theoretically, as an individual, and then exponentially so when joining forces in the form of a coalition. And I think that's important for kind of situating ourselves in the context of this moment, because there are a lot of people who would be, and they are potentially strong friends to current progressive movements, who have been successfully reached by, and to my mind, sort of indoctrinated in the wrong direction by forces who are would have the working class remain separated by race. And so, you know, towards the end of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, he created something called the Poor People's Campaign. And it was more controversial and radical even than a lot of his previous efforts, in that he was building a unified coalition across races of people who were acknowledging the intertwining evils of racism and classism and capitalism's worst outcomes. And that was an incredibly threatening, powerful moment that was cut short with his death. It has been reinvigorated recently. It's currently led by Reverend William Barber, a faith leader from North Carolina who is interested in building that sort of coalition again today. And they're out there doing their thing. I've been to a lot of their events, and in Kansas, you know, I'll march and I'll see all shades of people, and what they have in common is economic strife. Now, a coalition with that as its sort of unifying feature faces a few disadvantages in this moment of historic wealth inequality. And one is that it is by definition driven by people who lack capital of all sorts, be that social or cultural capital. And so we're at this moment, I think that the most important work that we can do toward invigorating that group toward progressive coalition building has to do with our public schools, with civics education, with getting the message of agency to a group of people that has to some extent been successfully targeted by and even anti-government and anti-coalition ideas. I know a lot of white working class people who themselves are very suspicious of unions, and there are some good reasons for that, but they're mostly politicized and weaponized and largely untrue ideas about movements that in fact would help that very population if people who believed in the possibility of their progressive activism would reach out to them. Thank you.
Sorry, am I audible now? I've been, can people hear me? Yes, sorry about that. My computer, I don't know exactly what has happened. I'm now on an iPad. This is not exactly optimal for facilitating the discussion, but I'm gonna do my best for the next few minutes. I'm so sorry to everyone on the panel and everyone in the audience. I'm gonna see if I can restart and get it going so I can see their questions soon. But we do have a few minutes now to talk to each other. I started jotting down some questions before technology decided to attack, but I'm also wondering whether any of you have questions or reflections or comments for each other before I start, before I jump back in.
I have a question for my fellow panelists, actually for all of them, because they all touched on it in a different way, if I could ask the question.
That would be great, thank you.
All of you, Alex, Jen, Sarah, talked a little bit about narratives. So not just what coalitions do or how coalitions function, but also how we talk about them and some misinformation and disinformation that may be pervasive about coalitions. How do you think you deal with that? How do you think you deal with false narratives or invented narratives about coalitions that exist over time?
I'll jump in quickly as the resident journalist and member of the media. This is something that I think about a lot, and it's one of the reasons why I touched on it in talking about you know, tales that are told about the white working class. You know, for me, one of the reasons that I might be valuable in a newsroom is that I can readily, by way of my firsthand experience and being surrounded by, believe it or not, progressive white working class people who I know firsthand, I can call, you know, excuse the phrase BS on prevailing narratives about that group because I know it firsthand. And so this is an argument for, you know, this might seem sort of far removed, but the diversification of information streams and media makers, because you know, a woman of color is going to see and understand the truths of a story that concerns race and gender in a way that an all-white male newsroom will not. And so one thing is just making sure that there is representation within the fields that create narratives that shape our propensity for coalition building.
I guess I would add to that the role of policy in creating narratives or upending narratives. When I think about the example that Sarah gave of the anti-union narrative that's been developed on the right, policy has played a big role in that by by passing policies like right to work laws, collective bargaining cutbacks, reducing the power of labor unions, it means that fewer people know what labor unions are or what they do. We see this consistently in survey after survey. A lot of people just don't know anyone in a union unless they've had family members in very specific parts of the country. And that has a big effect on narrative. It opens up the space for someone to come in, like a Scott Walker in Wisconsin, and racialize, for instance, public sector labor unions, create them as an outgroup, to use the framework developed by Jen, that can be readily demonized and facilitate further cutbacks in policy.
Yeah, I just want to agree. My version, or I guess my field, hopefully, role in examining at least prevailing narratives is collecting data, right? So there's a story that we're told, and either the available data will bear it out or it'll say no. And in fact, in the case that Sarah just brought up with some collaborators, Eric Knowles and Monica McDermott, another psychologist and a sociologist, we've collected data on the white working class and examined commitments, attitudes, beliefs, and differential understandings of who they are vis-a-vis their class identity, and racial identity and American identity. And you see a far more diverse picture, the very same one that Sarah was telling, than you often hear in the media. And so really saying, well, actually, if you look at people say for themselves what is true for them and what they think about relevant outgroups, immigration, racial minorities, you see a very different picture, a far more diverse perspective on these issues than we hear normally we hear about. So I think that is also another, at least the one that I probably put too much faith in, but they pay me to do this, so I have to.
If I could jump in now that I'm back, this is a slightly different sort of tack on this question, but part of what has been striking in my work is the way it sort of works in both directions, both the kinds of things Alex is talking about and the kinds of things Jen has been talking about, in the sense that among, and I have to say, I think LCCR, or what used to be LCCR, but is now LCCHR, yeah. Has been a really interesting case study in some of these narratives, and in using its position as a narrative shaper for progressive politics. I think I'm not telling you anything you don't know, having worked there, but it's worth, I think, kind of underscoring. And some of this I write a little bit about this in my book, but particularly when it comes to immigration, how LCCR in the day really kind of changed the story it told about immigration to its own constituents as a way to try to expand rather than contract the coalition, right? And to kind of make clear to its constituent organizations that some of the kind of protectionist stories that the organization itself had come to think differently about, some of the protectionist stories it was telling about labor and immigration, and the sort of honesty, I think, that it was willing, that the organization's leaders were willing to, that they were willing to be honest about their own changing thinking, their own new understandings, seemed both really important in kind of bringing other organizations along, but also, the reason I'm sort of dwelling on this so long, were sort of consistent, that kind of thing was a consistent theme in the research, in my own research, that organizations having some humility, organization leaders having humility and being willing to tell themselves and their constituents their own stories about how they came to see the intersections among issues. Was a really important important factor in differentiating groups that kind of stayed unintersectional and organizations that became more intersectionally oriented, if that makes sense. Does anyone else want to speak to this question? We do. Any other
So
question?
one
Sorry.
more thing that is partly inspired by the crazy moment that we're in right now, and that's the role of crisis in all of this, whether it's a crisis of political opposition like conservatives faced in the 60s and 70s, or an economic crisis, one that magnifies identities related to, say, caretaking, family responsibilities, health status. I think these are moments that create the possibility for narratives to be shifted if organizations are in place and ready to take advantage of the moment. But that seems worth elevating.
Yeah, and again, in sort of both directions too, right? The willingness to be able to tell certain kinds of stories about how to understand the moment we're in and the kinds of effects it's having, and also what's going to get us out of it. We're seeing a little all too clearly in some ways how the moment is amenable to different interpretations and differently evolving thinking about how to understand it and how to make it better. Any other questions for each other before we, or comments? I did, Alex, want to ask you to because you were very succinct in your sort of lessons for the left from the right, and I wanted to give you the chance maybe to say just a little bit more, both in terms of what does travel from the work you've done on conservative organizations, and maybe what doesn't travel, but what that might tell us as well, if you're willing.
Yeah, I think the question of organizational structure is something that the left can certainly learn, that is not an innovation that conservatives alone have a monopoly on. Whether or not it's a structure that looks like the one that I offered, where the highest bidder gets to set the agenda, is another question. But I think coming up with ways to prioritize competing demands, setting agendas in ways that are understood and accepted by all, and making use of the scarce resources that are invested in a coalition are all things that left-leaning groups, coalitions of the disadvantaged, could learn from. Similarly, thinking about the opportunities to use policy to unite previously disparate interests or draw new members into a coalition is certainly one that I think the left could learn from and use as well. As I alluded to, I think it's just a lot harder to build new institutions through policy than it is to destroy them or to weaken them. So I think it's an inherent challenge for groups representing disadvantaged or marginalized communities that need organizations and institutions, I think even more than some of the actors that I was studying on the right, that by virtue of their capital, political and economic, don't need that kind of support. But I'd point those two things out, and then underscore the importance of values and principles that guide the coalitions. What are the limits of what you're willing to accept in terms of internal contradictions, group members that may be pushing in a different direction? And I think that's going to be dependent on the nature of the composition of the coalition.
Yeah, so we have a curated list of questions from the audience. If it's okay, I'll turn to the first one now. I'll also warn everyone that while I'm doing this, I'm going to try to get back on my laptop because it'll make it a lot easier to facilitate the next 15 minutes if I'm not on an iPad. So if you see me pop up twice, I apologize. But here's a question that's come in for Alex and Allyn, although I would invite anyone who has any insights, because I think there are different ways of thinking about this, which is what is your sense of the level of organization on the right now compared to the left? So the kind of, the extent, I think, probably, and the organizedness of conservative versus progressive organization. We're seeing a lot of mobilization, and we might also want to think a little bit about, and this I think goes to, this goes to, in some ways, Alex, what you were just talking about whether, whether we also want to think about different metrics. So the kind of level and extent of organization, and whether maybe there are different forms, different levers for change other than organization, or not. And I think, again, this has been asked of Allyn and Alex, but I think Jen, your work on the kind of individual level might also have some bearing here, and Sarah, your observations about, I think, or, in your experience with thinking about different points of entry, different levers for thinking about change. Maybe since Alex, I had just put you on the spot, I'll go to Allyn first.
Yeah, I think that fairly well organized. I think I don't want to overstate that though, and I think that it is important to, and I'd have heard of Alex on this who was studying this, what we see, I think, is when there is a policy setback. So I'll use the example of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society on the right, which has just become a judge manufacturing factory, a hotbed in the center of gravity for all of the judicial work that happens on the right. And that was in response to a Supreme Court justice that they thought betrayed them, that they had put their faith and confidence in and then let them down. So they organized around that. And I think that level of agility, so now we just take it as an article of faith that the right has always been this organized around judges, and that's not the case. That in looking at the longer term is a relatively new phenomena. So I do think we see that. I mean, I think we saw a lot of organization. People were talking about the Koch brothers as far as their money was concerned, but I think their organization was also formidable in a variety of ways, of the ways that they helped organize at a variety of levels. So I would say I think it's fairly organized. I would say that the left is trying to be, the progressive side of things is trying to be agile with the movement and trying to be organized. I will say I was outside of the movement before joining the leadership conference, more organized than I thought it was. And I think that is, but there's still more work to do in that regard.
Alex, if you're willing to take a stab.
Sure. I think some of the question comes down to which venue we're talking about. I think for many years it was the case, as I've documented in my work, that that conservatives were simply more active in creating institutions that were agile, well-funded, and well-organized across the states at the state level than progressives were, certainly then I would say throughout the 80s to about 2016. And progressives just dedicated much more attention to national level politics, ironically judicial politics, the legal system, even after the Federalist Society began turning into a judicial nomination machine. So it's a question of venue, and I think that's shifted certainly for the states as a result of the election of Trump and the conservative dominance that we've seen in recent years. But it remains to be seen how much of that will translate into long-term gains of the same sort that conservatives have enjoyed since 2010 and 2014. It'll be the case that it'll be a while until we see the fruits of that, of those investments that have been made in state level politics. The other thing I'll note is that I think when it comes to social movements, the left has been far more organized in very recent years. We've seen just an enormous outpouring of energy, whether it's around police violence this year, the teacher strikes, the Women's March and the resistance. I mean, it's just an enormous upswell. And the question in my mind is, how much does that translate to durable organizations and institutions and changes in public policy that lock in those gains? To take the example of the teacher strikes, which I've been tracking quite closely, they secured some important victories in increasing education spending, increasing teacher salaries, but in many of these states, they didn't end up changing labor law, which means that over the long run, they're still at a substantial disadvantage. And so whether or not you get the sort of Wagner-esque moment where mass uprisings of workers translate into policy shifts that then reinforce those organizations, I think it's an open question and will certainly dictate the fate of both the labor uprisings and the protests around racial violence that we've seen this year.
Can I also add that, I apologize, winning and losing also makes it, there's a narrative fight in this as well. So there's the reality of how well or not well organized certain parts of the movement are on the progressive side or on the right. But there's also the narrative that exists. So if people go back to 2016, everyone was predicting the end of right politics. Everyone was saying that it was on its death knell because of the demographics, because of their candidate, because of, everyone was eulogizing the right. And I think in a way that we didn't hear people doing in 2018. And I think that winning and losing, the narrative also features into this as well.
Yeah, and probably has implications too for I mean, we've been talking about organization, but also for the sustainability of the coalitions among both organizations and then actors who may or may not, there's also a question that we've talked a little bit less about, but that will probably come up later today, about the sort of difference between formal coalitions among organizations, like the LCCR, and the kinds of coalitions that Alex has studied and I have studied, and then kind of the kind of coalitional thinking at the individual level that Jen has studied and that Sarah's talked about, and then the kind of mid-range of those as well, which is sort of, groups that ally but may not be as formally connected as LCCHR or the AFL-CIO's unions, within it, or the access that the teachers union has to other kinds of unions because of their coalition under the AFL. Jen, did you want to speak to this question, or do you?
I can briefly. I don't want. I want to make sure there's more time for questions. But I do think what you just raised and what you raised a little bit earlier, Dara, about the need for organizations, especially older organizations that have a history of exclusionary attitudes and behavior, to own up to that in order to bring in formerly excluded groups, into the fold legitimately. So one, acknowledging that and saying that is who we were, that is not who we understand ourselves to be now, and we are doing differently. And so sort of that kind of identity space and work needs to happen to genuinely build the coalition, and which I think is the hard one, and we see it in our politics, but we also see it in our coalition, some real active changes to power structures and power sharing. And it's not just, we want you to work with us and we think it'll be good for you. It's, we want to create a new we. And this we is not, it really is a kind of a new version, if not internally new entity that we're sort of forging together. And I think that is where we often see these sort of temporary coalitions fall apart. They don't do one or the other, or they don't do either. And that makes it really hard, because again, these are people's cherished identities that they're sort of bringing to the table. And especially when people come because of concerns about marginalization, then feel marginalized in this space that's supposed to be there for protection and moving forward, it actually then turns into betrayal and almost feels worse, like a greater violation than how people felt to begin with. So I think it's hard, in other words.
A lot of it does come down to it's hard. There's no doubt, but it's also, just to kind of pick up on a thread and rethread it a little bit too, the ways in which organizations, and I think again going back to something both Alex and Allyn have mentioned, and also public policy, I think Sarah touched on this as well, in helping to forge more expansive versus less expansive versions of who we is, and I'm using is on purpose instead of our, what is the we under this rubric? There's actually been some interesting work in political science. Some of my former students have done. Zain Murad is one who's looked at the actual intentional creation of the LGBT acronym, and has sort of documented the ways in which organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, not unlike some of what LCCR has done, and the NGLTF, sort of spoke openly about, who is going to be included under this umbrella and how, and what is that going to mean, and how are we going to kind of forge it. So we're getting the 2-minute mark, and again, if you see my hand, it's because now I'm on this iPad and I have to press the screen. So I'm going to ask one last question that I think will bring in. Sorry, I had it up here before. This is also part of the problem with the iPad. I think this is aimed, I think, at everybody. And it's a particular version of some of the questions, which is what messaging strategies have been effective historically in recruiting skeptical white working class people to coalitions. I think this goes to the broad question of who the we is. But Sarah, maybe you want to take the first stab at this one, and then we'll wrap things up.
Sure. A lot of people, probably many who are joining today, come to this conversation by way of college classrooms and academic experiences and a formal sort of discourse. But there are also a lot of people whose interests in and connection to coalition building come by way of life experience, and an underestimated facet of that is culture. The right has been much more adept at leveraging culture toward their sort of targeted group in terms of persuasion. And 40 or 50 years ago, things like the American flag, patriotism, country music, and rural spaces were not synonymous with or presumed to be somehow conservative. Yet that's true today. So they've kind of taken these symbols and used them to tap into someone's existing identity, which is in itself a sort of apolitical function, and politicized it to great effect. And in a very disingenuous way, to my mind, because most of those folks don't know anything about pickup trucks or working on a farm. But the left could learn from that culture is a powerful force, and to kind of reclaim those symbols.
Do people want to offer maybe 30-second last thoughts before the anchor pulls us all off the virtual stage?
Yeah, I would just, say one, I think it's important to really message that what we're trying to do, build these coalitions and make them sustaining, is incredibly hard, and not to downplay the difficulty. I think in part because people think it should be, well, our interests are aligned, so this should be no problem. No, it's incredibly hard. But at the same time, Sarah said, there's a long history of any number of these coalitions existing, even if just for a short time, but to great ends. And to remember that it is possible. I mean, obviously there's the MLK case, but there's also Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition, then Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, to William Barber, the suffragists and the abolitionists. There are any number of examples of this that show it's possible. And so it's important to give it a go.
With that, I'm afraid we are out of time. So I would like to just take the last 3 seconds to thank all the panelists for your excellent presentations and comments, for the audience, for the questions we were able to actually get to, and to everybody, especially people behind the scenes, for bearing with my technical difficulties. I am terribly sorry, but I'm glad we were able to sort of get back up here. And I'll hope to see as many of you at the 3 o'clock panel that starts in 14 minutes. Thank you so much. I'll give everyone a round of applause.